Thank you. And this is a pamphlet that just came out a couple of weeks ago, Myth of Democracy and the Rule of the Banks. And I was the writer, but I didn't make the cover, and I didn't lay it out. And I want to acknowledge the other people who did a lot of work on this, who were John Britton, Natalie Hritzi, Saul Kanowitz, and Keith Pavlik. And what this pamphlet tries to do, this is not groundbreaking academic research or something. It's an attempt to take a subject, economics and finance, which I think has a tendency to make people's eyes glaze over when they get to the first term that they don't understand, to try to explain what's happened over the last few years and the role of the banks in society, in the society we live in a way that's understandable and accessible to the average person who's interested. You can't make people interested who are not interested. That's one lesson we know. But if people are interested, we're trying to present literature. The PSL is trying to present literature that is really popular, readable, accessible, and so forth. I think probably everybody here knows that in 2008, there was a $700 billion bailout of the banks, along with trillions of dollars in guarantees that were put up by the government. It wasn't the first bailout in history. As Toya was talking about, if JP Morgan Chase had not lost $4.4 billion or $5 billion or whatever, but if they'd lost $15 billion on their latest betting deal in derivatives, then they would probably be being bailed out again right now. The too big to fail idea has been entrenched. And when the bailout happened, it was very interesting when you look back on it, and we talk about it in the pamphlet. When the bailout happened, there was this big panic in 2008 when one of the big investment banks called Lehman Brothers collapsed after another one had collapsed called Bear Stearns. And there was a big panic, and the Treasury Department, which is headed by people who come from Wall Street, inevitably, and the Federal Reserve and the Democrats and the Republicans all got together, the leaders, and said, we got to do something, we got to bail. They're all going to fail, or most of them are going to fail unless we bail them out. And there was a big fight in Congress, and in the first round in the House of Representatives, something that has never happened in my lifetime, there was actually a contested vote, and you didn't know the outcome of it until it happened. And it was defeated, and then the panic level was stepped up, and a week later it went through. And Henry Paulson, who had come from, I believe, did he come from JP Morgan Chase? Or Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs. He called the program the Troubled Assets Recovery Program, which is more of that Washington speak, because how can an asset be troubled? I mean, people can be troubled, but things just really can't be. But that's part of the, they want to say, and they had another phrase that they used, they talked about toxic assets. What does that mean? Does that mean it's an asset that isn't an asset? Or it's an asset that's worth a lot less than it used to be worth? But this kind of language is thrown around, and all the media that works for them, the corporate media, picked it up and ran with it. In the fall of 2008, it was still Bush in office, and it was the Bush team, and they pushed it through. The Democrats were actually more for the bailout even than some of the Republicans were. And soon-to-be President Obama was asked, do you think that if the bailout's going to be passed, there should be a requirement of the banks that they should make some alterations in the mortgages of the people who are losing their homes now, because the foreclosure crisis was already underway, and this is what was underpinning the fall of housing prices. This is what was really playing a major role in bringing down the economy. And Obama, then candidate Obama, said, no, he didn't think so because that would slow down the process too much. So as a result, not only were there no concessions written into this enormous bailout, the biggest bailout in the history of humanity, no provisions for people who were losing their homes, but there were virtually no requirements at all. And a couple months later, a reporter went around to, called all the 80-some banks that got money in the bailout. And he asked them, what'd you do with the money? And this is J.P. Morgan Chase spokesperson. They got $25 billion. He said, "We've not disclosed that to the public. We're declining to." The representative of the Bank of New York Mellon who got $3 billion. "We're choosing not to disclose that." Morgan Stanley got $10 billion. "We're going to decline to comment on your story." And that's how it went right down the line. And of course, if the banks didn't have to, they didn't want to say what they did with the money. But the amazing thing is that the Congress, when they wrote the law, and the Treasury Department, the administration, they didn't put any requirements in that they had to even say what they had done with the money. They just got the money. And, you know, anybody who knows anything about government grants, if you've ever been part of like a little community organization that gets some grant, you got to tell them where every penny went. Otherwise, they come after you and they want the money back and they'll never give you any money again and so forth. But here, this incredible giveaway with no requirements. And I think that what that does is it shows us something. It shows us something very important about the power, the real power relationships. You know, we hear a government of, by, and for the people. It's not a government of, by, and for the people. It's a government of, by, and for them. Because how else could this happen? I mean, that government with its police forces, its military, its prisons, its courts, and so forth, all its instruments of repression, it rules over the people, but the banks rule over them. And these are the same banks who, like, until a few months before this happened, you could always see them on the business channels and so forth, and they were always talking about, get government off our back, you know, and we're rugged individualists and, you know, the chest thumpers. But when they got in trouble, they ran to the government crying, rescue us, save us, and their government did. They didn't do the same thing for the people who are the millions of people who were losing their homes, their jobs, their health care, their pensions. You know, there would be a moral hazard involved, they said, you know, to help people who, you know, people got to work hard and make their money, except when it came to them. And so what caused this economic crisis? And Toya made some references to it when she spoke. And the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. And I want to read something from 1877, written by a man named Friedrich Engels, who was Karl Marx's closest collaborator. And he said, "As a matter of fact, since 1825, that was 50 years earlier, when the first general crisis broke out, the whole industrial and commercial world, production and exchange, are thrown out of joint about once every 10 years. Commerce is at a standstill, the markets are glutted, products accumulate, hard cash disappears, credit vanishes, factories are closed. The mass of workers are in want," and this is a key point, "are in want of the means of subsistence because they produce too much of the means of subsistence. The stagnation lasts for years, productive forces and products are wasted and destroyed wholesale until the accumulated mass of commodities," you might think houses here, "finally filter off, more or less depreciated in value. Little by little, the pace quickens. It becomes a trot, the industrial trot." This is horse talk. There were no cars yet. "The industrial trot breaks into a canter. The canter, in turn, grows into a headlong gallop of a perfect steeplechase of industry, commercial credit, and speculation, which finally, after breakneck leaps, ends where it began, in the ditch of a crisis." That's kind of a very good description of bubbles and economic crisis down to today. The unique feature of capitalism is, as Engels puts it, the mass of the workers are in want of the means of subsistence because they have produced too much of the means of subsistence. And there's something else along the same line called the miner's riddle from back in the 1930s, where a little girl says to her father, who's a coal miner, "Why is it so cold in our house?" And he replies, "We don't have any money to buy coal." "Why don't we have any money to buy coal?" "Because I was laid off from my job at the coal mine." "Why did the coal mine lay you off?" "Because we produce too much coal." This is the absurdity, the criminal absurdity of capitalism, that in no previous period of humankind, the existence of humans, whether it was communal society or societies based on slavery, the slave mode of production, or the feudal mode of production, in no earlier time would a crisis be caused by too much being produced. I mean, the main cause of crisis, and there were many crises, many thousands and thousands of crises, were mainly produced by scarcity, right? And mostly scarcity of food, caused by drought or, locusts or, whatever, floods, all those kinds of things. But the idea that there could be a crisis because too much existed, too much was produced. And and this is what we've seen again. For now, we might substitute the word houses for coal in the current crisis, although that's not the only thing that was overproduced. Capitalist overproduction, as Engels said way back then, 135 years ago, in 1877, all the way down to the present, the cause of crisis, of capitalist crisis, the fundamental cause is capitalist overproduction. And we have to be clear about that, what that means. It's not that too much is produced in relation to human need, but that too much is produced to be able to be sold at an adequate profit from the capitalist point of view in the market. And, but the banks, in this particular crisis, made it much worse. And there's a section of the pamphlet called How the Banks Made It Worse. And this talks about the way in which the housing bubble was created, this housing bubble that we've seen. And, I don't know if people remember, but a few years ago, the price of homes was just skyrocketing. And the banks were doing a lot of carrying out a lot of fraudulent activity in order to fuel this and to make the greatest possible profits through fees and interest and so forth. Now, the old way of selling homes and mortgages and so forth, there was nothing great about it. People in a typical way with a fixed rate mortgage, they would pay over 20 years or 30 years, they would end up paying twice the face value of the house when they paid off the interest. It was exploitative. But the banks came up with things to accelerate their take from this. And one of them was called the subprime loan. The subprime loan meaning that at the beginning, you have a very low interest rate for maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years, and then it balloons. And they sold these subprime loans very aggressively because they knew that if they could get people to take a subprime loan rather than a regular fixed rate loan, which pays a lot of money, they make a lot of profit off that, but they could make even greater profit. So they gave bonuses to the people who were selling the mortgages at the base level in order to get them. You got a bonus if you got paid more if you could sell someone a subprime loan, even if they didn't need a subprime loan. Or had no reason to. And the way they would sell people subprime loans is they would say to them, look at the way the price of houses is going up. When your balloon payment kicks in, when your higher interest rate, when your higher mortgage payment kicks in, you'll be able to sell your house at a far higher price. And, you'll be able to pay this off easy, and you'll probably be able to get a new car and take a vacation. It'll be great. Except there's one little problem there. The prices don't keep going in the same direction. And when the market became saturated, when it was capitalist overproduction, meaning that there were too many houses to be sold at what the capitalists, the construction industry, the banks considered to be an adequate profit, then it created a crisis in society. And they proceeded to start the foreclosure process and all that. In many cases, there was documentable in millions of cases, not many, millions of cases, there's documentable fraud that went on in this process on the part of the. And another thing that really pushed this forward, made the selling of getting people to take loans no matter what their financial situation was, and also to try to get them to take as big a loan as possible. So the banks, in some cases, created their own appraisal units that were under their control. So they would look at a house and say, oh, the house, no, it's not worth $300,000, it's worth $400,000. So that'll be your loan. And there was all this kind of stuff. I mean, immense quantities of immense amounts of criminal behavior. And also the creation of something called a mortgage-backed security, MBS. spurred on this whole process. This is something that didn't exist, I think, until maybe 25 years ago or something like that, 30 years ago. But the mortgage-backed security means that you take a bunch of mortgages, put them together, and sell them as bonds, basically, as securities. And they're sold on the marketplace, and sometimes they're cut up and put back together and all this. And they're sold in the marketplace with the idea that if you buy the bond, you will get the interest payment, and you'll be paid off by the mortgage, by the people who bought the mortgage, making their mortgage payments, right? So the idea of this became just endemic in the whole mortgage business. So that whereas before, when a bank gave someone a mortgage, still in this exploitative process, they had an interest in whether or not the person who took the mortgage would pay back the mortgage, right? They had a direct interest. They were holding the mortgage. But with mortgage-backed securities, what it meant was what were called the mortgage originators, companies like Countrywide Financial, which was the number one, but not only one, but the biggest one in the United States. They wouldn't have a mortgage loan for more than a few days. They would sell it. They would get fees. The sellers would get bonuses. The company would get fees, like the fees that go along with taking out a mortgage. And then they would sell the mortgage to JP Morgan Chase or Goldman Sachs or Lehman Brothers or Merrill Lynch or one of those, and they would bundle them together and sell them as securities, meaning that the originators of the mortgage had no interest whatsoever if anybody ever paid them back. They already made their money on it. And this new creation of a new way and Toya was referring this, is that not creating anything of value, but creating things that they called financial products. Well, financial products, you can't wear them, you can't eat them, you can't live in them, you can't do anything with them except speculate. And so there was this wild speculation. The impact, I don't think, probably needs to be said that, today, there are, in reality, 24 million people in the United States who are either completely unemployed or are very underemployed and want to be full-time employed. The number of long-term jobless people is the largest since records have been kept of this. And millions of people continue to suffer foreclosure, loss of their home. Many times loss of your job means loss of your pension, loss of your health care. And the outcome of this normal, and this is the normal process of capitalism, as it becomes wilder and wilder, the search for turning money into greater money without producing anything, is that today 48% of the population of the United States, the richest country in the world, is classified as either living in poverty or low income. And to qualify for the poverty level, for a family of four, it's $22,400 or less, a ridiculous figure. So many of the people classified low income are really living in poverty, and many of the people who aren't classified either poverty or low income are low income. And this is a result of the system itself. I want to say a little bit, the pamphlet goes into unpunished crimes of the banks. One of them is, I want to read a little of it. It's Wachovia Bank, which doesn't exist anymore, one of the many casualties of the crisis absorbed by Wells Fargo. In March 2010, their executives agreed to a settlement which basically was admitting on their part that they had laundered $378 billion in Mexican drug cartel money. And this is money that is essential to the drug cartels to be able to buy weapons, to pay their armies, to buy planes so that they could transport larger quantities, and that's what they did with it. I mean, you can't go into like Boeing in Seattle, with a big bag of $5 bills and say, I'd like to buy, a plane. That doesn't work. It has to be laundered through the banks so that it looks like it's legitimate money. And so money laundering is critical to the operation of, and it's not just the Mexican drug business, it's the US drug businesses. Drug businesses all over the world are dependent. Only these big banks are able to do the kind of laundering they want and that they need. So here's what happened, though, out of it. This was a June 30th, 2010 Bloomberg News article, quoted lead federal prosecutor Jeffrey Sloman. Wachovia's blanket disregard for our banking laws gave international cocaine cartels a virtual carte blanche to finance their operations. A man named Martin Woods, who had been the director of Wachovia's anti-money laundering unit, had quit after the Wachovia executives above him repeatedly ignored his documentation of drug dealers laundering funds through the banks. And this guy, he was the one in charge, he knew everything that was happening. He said, it's the banks laundering money for the cartels that finances the tragedy in Mexico. So, you know, if you are arrested for selling $378 worth of crack cocaine on the street, I believe the minimum is 5 years. So these guys must have really suffered, right? None of them spent a day or an hour in jail. All this talk about by the federal prosecutor of how horrible this was, and you know what a crime. A year after the settlement, or at the time of the settlement in 2010, Wachovia was fined, now Wells Fargo, incorporated into Wells Fargo, $110 million for $378 billion in money laundering, of which we don't know what their take was of it, but it was a lot, and a $50 million penalty. And then they continued the criminal investigation until the spring of 2011, and then the federal government dropped the criminal investigation altogether, and that was it for Wachovia. There is regular predatory practices by the banks on the elderly. And this is also endemic. I mean, this is millions of elderly people, many of them living alone, who get calls all the time, for all kinds of calls. But, you know, from friendly, nice people, and many times people, because of the atomized nature of capitalist, advanced capitalist society, many people are living alone, and if someone will, you know, speak nicely to them, you know, they can go a long way. It's very, very, it's a terrible kind of practices. It goes on a constant basis. Here's one situation. Doris Canales, who was an African-American woman in her 70s, sharing a home in Hackensack, New Jersey with several family members. She had purchased the house in 1999 with a monthly payment of $1,700 on a mortgage of $192,000. According to her family, she was now suffering in late 2008 from serious health problems, including kidney failure and declining lucidity. Her monthly payment had soared to over $4,000, and the house was being foreclosed. How did this happen? The New York Times did an investigative article, one of very few. You know, like once in a while they do this when this is happening all around them constantly. Mrs. Canales told the New York Times, they just call and say, hey, do you need money in the bank? And I was like, yeah, I need money in the bank. Between 2002 and 2008, she refinanced 13 times with a wide range of banks, including Wells Fargo, Wachovia, IndyMac, Countrywide, and Chase. And these were mostly what are called no-doc transactions, meaning she was not required to produce any documentation. And she received, in these 13 transactions refinancing, between $2,000 and $10,000 on each one. The bank fees for each transaction ranged from $19,000 to $39,000. In 2008, her mortgage had nearly tripled to $544,000, while the market value of the house had dropped from a high of $619,000 to $480,000. She could no longer meet the mortgage payments nor refinance. The banks prey on students and former students. You know, there's over now $1 trillion, $1 trillion. How many people here have student loan debt? Okay, keep your hands up. How many people here have ever had student loan debt?
Not very much.
Well, so why do we have student loan debt? How come? Yeah, and well, so it's over $1 trillion. It's not unusual today, and the average now for student graduating is $24,000. It's not unusual for people to have $100,000. And here's what a man named Barmak Nasirian, who was from the American Association of College Registrars and Admissions Officers, about a year ago, August 17th, Atlantic Monthly said, "You will be hounded for life. They will garnish your wages. They will intercept your tax refunds. Professional licenses can be revoked, and you can become ineligible for federal employment, unable to pay a key element of our society. Our college-educated youth will find themselves swamped by late fees and interest piling up insurmountably." And also, in many cases, relatives who co-sign for loans can also, if someone dies, and people are taking out insurance policies on the lives of people who they co-sign for, which is good for the insurance industry. People over the age of 60 collectively owe more than $36 billion in student debt. Since 1996, the Debt Collection Improvement Act, passed by the Republican Congress and signed by Bill Clinton, Democrat Bill Clinton, has authorized the Treasury Department to collect money owed to the federal government by garnishing federal benefits and pay. That includes, they can garnish up to 15% of Social Security benefits for student loans. And barring revolutionary change in the United States, which we're hoping for, of course, and this is why everyone really has an interest in revolution. All those people, particularly all of you who raised your hand, is that people will be paying until they die on their student debts. And that's not an exaggeration. And I want to read one other thing that shows what the government, how the government, these crimes, this level of criminality, and so many people from inside the banking industry have spoken about this. People who are really in high positions, like executive vice presidents in charge of money laundering, who couldn't get anybody to pay attention to them. And here's an interesting conversation that took place last December on 60 Minutes when a woman named Eileen Foster, who was an executive of Countrywide Financial, which collapsed and was also absorbed by Bank of America. She was interviewed by 60 Minutes, and they said to her, "Do you believe there are people at Countrywide who belong behind bars?" "Yes." "Do you want to give me their names?" "No." "Would you give their names to a grand jury if you were asked?" "Yes." "How much fraud was there at Countrywide?" From what I saw, the types of things I saw, it appeared systemic. It wasn't just one individual or two or three individuals. This was her job, was investigating fraud. She was in charge of that and went around the country to investigate. It was branches of individuals. It was regions of individuals. What you seem to be saying, it was just a way of doing business. Yes. And the amazing thing about this, I think it's somewhat still amazing, is that despite her extensive knowledge of systemic fraud at Countrywide, the Department of Justice never contacted her. Or any other government agency ever contacted her to, in the last part of the pamphlet, before the part about seize the banks, I raised the question, can the capitalist system be fundamentally reformed? And the liberal critics of the banking system, people who really know a lot, like Joseph Stiglitz, who was the chief economist at the notorious World Bank, and Simon Johnson, who was the chief economist at the equally notorious IMF, and Paul Krugman, and Robert Reich, who used to be Secretary of the Treasury, and who's become like this big kind of darling of liberaldom. People seem to have forgotten that he was a big supporter of NAFTA and continues to be a big supporter of NAFTA. But they all have, in their books that they've written and interviews and so forth, they have good information because they were on the inside, and they're critical of the system. And what they're calling for is they're bringing back the Glass-Steagall Act that went out in 1999, which said that there had to be a separation between commercial banks and investment banks. That was eliminated. That the size of the bank should be limited, or the biggest one should be broken up, or there should be more effective regulation. Well, from our point of view, the PSL's point of view, our program is not restore Glass-Steagall or more regulation or limit the size of the banks. I mean, we wouldn't be against them if that happens. But none of those reforms go far enough. And and all of them are reversible. And as has been very clearly, a lot of the bank regulations came about in the 1930s during the Great Depression, when there were basically no regulations, and many banks went under, and it intensified that crisis. The bank's aim, and all the capitalists' aim, the big capitalists, is to maximize profits in the short term, regardless of the cost to humans, regardless of the cost to the planet. For them, this is not optional. And that's what's very important, because it's not just that they're evil, profit-seeking, parasitic, gouging, all of which they are, individuals, but it's something bigger than that. And the something bigger is the system itself. The banks, finance capital, are the dominant section of the modern capitalist ruling class. They are in a life and death struggle with each other. I mean, they're fundamentally hostile to the people, to the workers, in particular to working people, but they're also in this bitter struggle with each other. And the latest crisis shows just how vicious a struggle it really is. I mean, I don't think a few years ago people would have imagined that these huge, wealthy agglomerations of capital like Bear Stearns or Lehman Brothers or Kodak or the original AT&T or which was one time the biggest employer in the private employer in the world, or Merrill Lynch, which was a household word but is now just a division of B of A. They kept the label. That those would all collapse, that they would all go. And the fact that they all did illustrates how brutal the struggle is between the capitalists themselves over who will emerge triumphant. Who will emerge triumphant is based on who will garner the greatest profit. So they're not thinking either about 5 years down the line. I mean, maybe somebody in the company is, but the people at the top are thinking about what's our profit margin going to be next quarter and this year and next year. And if it's not adequate, they stand to lose their positions. So they are all, and if they lose their positions, there's 20, vice presidents in line behind the CEO, ready, willing, and eager to take their place. That the banks dominate capitalism in this era is not something new. Even if some leftist intellectuals and quote-unquote academic Marxists, I think academic Marxist is a contradiction in term. Marxists are for struggle and, not just sitting in the ivory tower. But some of them seem to like to pretend that they are the ones who discovered this idea, that the banks are dominant, that finance capital is dominant. But in reality, nearly 100 years ago, in 1916, the great Russian revolutionary leader, V.I. Lenin, wrote a very important pamphlet, which we also have available here, titled Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And by highest, he meant the final stage of capitalism. And I want to say read a little of what he wrote back then. As banking develops and becomes concentrated in a small number of establishments, the banks grow from modest middlemen into powerful monopolies, having at their command almost the whole of the money capital of the capitalists. The economic essence of imperialism is monopoly capitalism, a financial oligarchy. An oligarchy literally means the rule of the few, which throws a close net of relations, of dependence, over all the economic and political institutions of contemporary capitalist society without exception. Such is the most striking manifestation of this monopoly. And when he wrote this, at that time, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a very small number of banks has only increased. 95% of all the trade in derivatives is controlled by 5 banks. 4 banks issue half of all home mortgages and 2/3 of all credit cards. And each of the 5 biggest banks has assets of more than $1 trillion, $1 million each one. These are, and the financial oligarchy, as Lenin pointed out, dominates politics, as we can see so clearly in the United States today, as well as the economy. And the Wall Street lobbyists, Wall Street corporations, through their lobbyists, pour billions of dollars, they'll pour billions of dollars this year into the election campaigns, but they also finance an army of lobbyists who are in Washington every day, meeting with, quote unquote, our representatives, having breakfast, lunch, and dinner with them, writing them checks, and in many cases, writing the laws that they then introduce and get passed on behalf of those corporations. So our program, the problem then with the argument of the reformers, and at one point, Robert Reich says that in order to bring about the reforms, he said, we have to get big money out of politics, otherwise everything else is hopeless. I mean, reflecting on this, well, how do you exactly do that? How do you get the money out of politics? Is the role of money in politics in the United States diminishing? Has anybody seen that trend? Because the reality is with things like the Citizens United case, which opened the door, corporations are people, free speech means they can donate, whatever they want to donate, and put into the campaigns. So the role of money, rather than diminishing, increases, intensifies. And how do you get the people in Congress who have written all the laws and are dependent on the lobbyists and the corporations, how do you get them to write laws against the interests of the corporations? Could we take a collection? No, we probably couldn't. We probably couldn't come up with enough. So our program is not a program of reform. Our program calls for seizing the banks, to guarantee the deposits of people, people who have small deposits or middle-sized deposits. That's not the problem. It's these vast agglomerations of the wealth of society created by the workers of society, both living and in the past. All of the wealth comes from the wealth that's accumulated comes either from nature or the labor of people. That's where it all comes from. And even the nature has to be converted into wealth by the labor. So it's really our money. They got our money. That's the real bottom line. It's stolen property. It's stolen wealth. And it needs to be taken back. And if it was taken back, then we would, and this would be as, of course, only as a result of a revolutionary development in society, and would be the first step in rebuilding society, reorganizing society on a socialist basis, meaning that the maximization of profit would be gone, because profit would be gone. The profit motive would be replaced by a different motive, and that motive would be to meet the needs of the people in a sustainable, long-term way. And I think that we can all probably see, and I would think that everyone here observes the dire circumstances, the dire environmental circumstances that confront the planet and the people on the planet, and the increasingly dire economic and social conditions that so many people, even here in the so-called richest country in the world, are forced to endure. So the pamphlet, I will summarize by saying this. I hope you get a copy. It's, from our point of view, ammunition. That's what it really boils down to. It's what you can use, what we can use to talk to other people and to try to explain in ways that are understandable why there needs to be a new system altogether. So this is what we do in conjunction as the PSL, in conjunction with our participation in the anti-war struggles and the struggles against racism and the struggles for women's rights, for LGBT equality for everyone, and for all the different struggles that we're involved in. But at the same time, we have to take the message that capitalism is bankrupt and it has to be replaced with a new system, a socialist system. Thank you.